Wake up.
Wake up, Africa, your time has come. Open up your eyes and see the sun. Open up your spirit.
Wake up, Africa.
Hello and welcome to Africa 101 on the Dr. Mumbi Show. You know, Africa 101 is all about some of the misconceptions we have about the African people, clearing up the air about some of the, the terms and things that we say in jest, but we might not really get the deeper, inner, hidden meaning of it. And so on this show, we just usually bring to light, as a kind of like take it as like a refresher course on all things African. Now, today I'm dealing with this whole term divide and conquer. We always hear how, the Europeans divided and conquered. But what did they divide and what did they conquer? So that's what I wanted to get into today. And, there's three levels that the division and the conquering took place. And I think it's important for us to understand this so that when we are, now that we're back into rebuilding ourselves, knowing ourselves and emancipating ourselves, through mental freedom, it's a good idea to know where this dividing and conquering happened so that we know where to rebuild in order to be truly free. Now, when it comes to dividing and conquering, there's three levels that were mainly attacked, and that's the individual level, the family level, and the community level. Now, when it came to dividing the individual, what the colonizer and the slave master did is they first attacked our minds. And they gave us, they first of all eradicated everything we knew about ourselves, eradicated our history. The first people to be killed, by the way, in both scenarios were the teachers and the spiritualists or the preachers, whatever you want to call them. They were the first to be erased, and we are a people where most of our history was passed down through oral tradition. And so the keepers of our knowledge and the keepers of our history, the medicine men, etc., were taken out. And so this kind of affected our mind, and our identity was taken through us because they got us here. Secondly, the second thing they did was divide us with our names. First, they demonized the indigenous name, made it seem evil, made it seem dirty, said they couldn't pronounce it. It was difficult to pronounce. They didn't understand it. If you wanted to be educated, for example, you couldn't use your indigenous name. If you accepted, Christianity, the religion of the colonizer, you had to be baptized and take on a new name. And so what happened is they started to divide up our name. So we were no longer had the name of our ancestors, which represented our destiny, our calling, our personality, our spiritual soul symbol. We now had a Margaret or a Elizabeth, which started to divide us and divide up and mess up with our psyche. Next, language. One of the things they did is when they took the children to school, especially with language, anytime you talk to your mother tongue, you'd get beaten, you'd get punished. And so they started to also teach our children, the language of the oppressor, and they started to label everything around us, according to their language. And so now we had generations that started growing up with two languages, where the indigenous language was what you use maybe at home, but in order to operate in their society, in order to operate in their schools or in their church, you had to learn the language of the oppressor. And this kind of shows how they started to divide up the mind of the African. Now, second level is the thing that the foundational rock that they went for was the family. And what they did is they divided the family by removing the father from the home, removing the children from the home, and then giving the mother, the responsibilities of the father and creating different roles than the traditional roles that we were used to. So what happened is that, the child was taken out of the home at a very young age. And, our education, what used to happen with African education is you learned by observation, and so from a young age, you were taught things. You were taught things by your mother or your father, depending on your sex. And then in the evenings, a lot of our oral tradition, a lot of our history, a lot of our knowledge was passed down around the fire. But now what they did is they took the child out the home and into the school, and burdened them with education. I'll get into that, the conquering. They also took the husband out of the home. And, by introducing, in Kenya, what they introduced is they introduced taxes. And so in order to pay those taxes, like first they had a hut tax. In order to pay those taxes, the husband had to leave the home and go look for work. Now the wife was, a lot of times we were made to believe, like, because a lot of the African communities were polygamous, women were made to believe that, they were in a unfair situation, or they had no influence and they had no power. When you really study it, the people who had no power are the Caucasian women. They're the ones who didn't have power. But African women had a place in their homes, had a place in society for a while. But they started messing with these roles and giving the woman the male roles. And this division is what really, really shook us at the root. Finally, community level. What they started with is they divided us up spiritually. They brought in their religion. They took away our social customs by giving us their own culture and their own social norms, and by demonizing our own traditions and our own culture. So, the things we used to do maybe at planting season and at harvest season, the rites we used to practice were demonized and they were made to be unchristian. And so in order to become a Christian, for example, or in order to become educated, you had to forsake your customs. That, it wasn't either or. They dangled the carrot and they whipped you with a stick, or they, pulled your culture from under your feet. And lastly, our system of governance, like especially with colonialism, it was a foreign government that just came over and implanted itself on our own government. And they totally made us believe that we had no system of governance, we had no system of, order. But that was a lie. The African governmental system was the most democratic, because it wasn't actually democratic. It was all inclusive, as in they would debate until the last person had agreed. So it wasn't if the majority get it, then 51% get it, and then we're left with 49% of the community disagreeing. No, they would debate and debate and debate until everyone was on the same page. And so our African system of governance was so far, but they totally divided this. And one of the ways that they divided us was to make everything we did, everything about our culture demonic, everything about our culture evil, everything about our culture backward. We were not the backward ones. They were. We'll be right back.
Wake up, wake up, wake up, wake up, wake up, wake up.
Welcome back to Africa 101, where we're looking at, dividing and conquering. What is meant when we say that, the oppressor divided and conquered us? That's what I've been getting into. I just talked about how we were divided, and now I want to get into how we were conquered. Don't forget to subscribe, guys. And if there's anything you'd like us to touch on, if there's anything you'd like us to speak on or research and share with the community, go ahead and leave us, a comment or get in touch on one of our handles, as you can see. Now, after being divided individually, on the family level, and among our community, they conquered us. And the way they conquered us, first of all, they gave us a new name. A lot of us, as I'm talking about particularly the Kenyan situation where we became Christians, a lot of us adopted a new name, or where, we were so, especially the Agikuyu community, let me speak for us. We were so into education. We found it so fascinating, the whole thing of writing. And so, in order to receive that knowledge, we had to take on a new name, which is basically a new identity. And I'll be doing something on the importance of names when I start my Decolonizing the Mind series. Next, they gave us a new language where, in order to fit into that world, we had to learn the language of the oppressor. In order to operate, we had to learn the language of the oppressor. And so this started to conquer us and give us a new identity, a new individuality, a new form of operating. And lastly, they gave us new desires that had not been ours. Especially now, if I can talk about, a lot of the women started having these romantic ideas of, wanting to be a teacher, because a lot of the teachers who came, they came with their cars, they had their dresses, they seemed free and liberal. And so a lot of young girls desired to be a teacher or desired to be a nurse, and without really understanding the implications. But we saw that as next, because everything about ourselves had been demonized. And so not only did we start to hate ourselves in a way, but we started to aspire and want the other. And among the Agikoyo, there were actually two very distinct communities, and this is why the Mau Mau rebellion actually happened. We had the Adhomi community, which was basically like the learned, the people who could read. That's what they were called, and the people who clung to the traditional ways of life. And what happened is that actually that was the huge clash that came about at independence. There were those who had become missionaries who totally embraced and dived into, the religion of the oppressor, the ways of the culture of the oppressor, and actually looked down on our own culture, versus those who were clinging on for dear life to our way of life. Secondly, if we look at the family level, what happened is, I told you, the way they divided is they divided up the family by removing everyone from the home. The first thing they did is they took the child from a young age, and from morning till evening. The children were removed from the home, so they no longer practiced, they no longer practiced their own tradition, but they were no longer involved in the ways of life of their people. And through this education, they started to learn new descriptions for, their mountains, their rivers. Everything was labeled by the colonizer. Every single thing was labeled by the colonizer. And so when they started to learn about, the traditional names of the rivers were wiped out, and this new young generation was given a whole new way of naming their reality. And this had a tremendous impact on our generation, on conquering us as a people. Secondly, the husband was removed from work. And what this meant is, because I told you earlier about the hut tax, but what meant is that they had to now leave the homes and either go to the cities or go to the farms in distant places to look for work. And what happened is a whole new culture arrived. There was this whole culture of prostitution, a whole different social structure of children out of wedlock, of, filthiness. Let me just put it that. And that came from removing the man from his family unit. So even the home of, of the African people was no longer protected because the men were away and the women were left to fend for themselves. Secondly, because the man was away, the woman moved into a decision-making role where she had to harvest herself. She had to discipline the children. She had to take on a lot of the male responsibilities. She had to contribute to like defense and etc. And so when the man came home and all of a sudden he wanted to be the king of the house, this started to create a lot of tension. And hence our way of life, our family units were totally conquered. Lastly, let's look at the community. How did they conquer us as a community? Number one, they gave us a new God. They totally killed our medicine men, they totally killed our spiritual teachers, and demonized our religion, demonized our practices, and then they gave us this new Christian God and this new, blonde hair, blue-eyed Jesus. Next, they gave us a new culture, where, from the way we dressed to the way people ate to, to even how people spent their free time, especially now that the men were in the cities. So, they brought the cinema and people are like, oh, that's so cool. They brought the disco. These are the things. And this is how we started. Our culture was completely replaced and conquered by this new culture. Lastly, I talked about how, the system of governance in Africa was more about, it was community-based. It was consensus, actually. That's the word I've been looking for. It was all about consensus. Everyone agreeing before people moved over. Now, what this meant is it took months to reach decisions. It took months because we had to take and weigh in everybody's decision. But, everyone felt included, and there were never those who excluded communities, etc. But what happened is they brought in this fake democracy. They brought in capitalism where, the majority win. They brought in their form of government. Then they took, a percentage of our brilliant young men and took them to the UK to be educated, took them to the US. I don't know if you've ever heard of the Kennedy airlifts, where, Kennedy and one of our local heroes, Tom Boyer, gave free tickets and education scholarships to all these young men and women. And what happened is this was done just before independence. So once we got independence, these young men and women who had been educated in the US, who had been educated in the UK and made to feel like this was the best system ever, came over and took over our nation. And so independence wasn't, it was a fake independence, because what happened is, you know, the Mzungu removed himself from the government, but he replaced himself with puppets that looked like me and you, but behaved like him. And that's why we're still entrapped till today. Because a lot of the people who got educated at that time, a lot of those people who got, you know, Christianity at that time, really believed they were better. They really believed they were civilized. And this is the tragedy of being divided and being conquered. Thank you for joining us on Africa 101. Join us next time when we, you know, shed light on everything African.
Open up your spirit.
Wake up, wake up, wake up, wake up, wake up, wake up, wake up.